Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I hope you've all been happily hunting, whether it's trials or you're dead. So today we're going to resume with part 2 of episode 2 because the witness statements were huge. I have learned my lesson. Something hot to drink. I'm going to need it. And chapstick. So let's dig in. All right, everyone. So when we left off, they had just collected evidence. At least the upstairs bedroom and from the barn. Zoom right here. I then summoned Mrs. Churchill, Hiram C. Harrington, and Alan Egan to appear in court at 4 p.m. Went in search of Dr. Handy, found him at Charles J. Holmes. Asked him would he accompany an officer to Boston to see a party whom the Boston police located, and who they thought resembled the person whom he saw. He said, "Well, I suppose I must go." I said, "No, there is nothing compulsory about the request." He did not seem to like the idea of going, and said, "It was a very warm night, and I have quite a number of cases on hand from which I expect bursts. But then I suppose they are as apt to come during the day as well as night. Wait a moment, I'll see." He then went to another part of the house and talked with the Holmes family for a few minutes. He then returned to the parlor and said, "Well, I'll go. Who's going with me? Is it you?" I told him I could not say. "Will the officer call at my house? Will he come in a carriage, or will I go to the depot in the horse car?" I said I did not know, but whichever way, the officer would be there in time. Arriving in Boston, we called at Station 4 and learned something of and the residence of the man we sought. We then went to police headquarters, and after transacting my business there, we retired. Evening, Wednesday 10th, 1892. Dougherty. Summoned Hannah H. Gifford, Alice Russell, Charles S. Sawyer, and Mrs. George Whitehead. Thursday the 11th, 1892. In the morning we went to Station 4, from whence a local officer accompanied us to number 19 Oxford Street, the home of Henrik Wood, the man wanted. Mr. Wood was not at home. He had gone to Lexington in the morning to see a friend who was building a house near a lot owned by him. From the lady who came to the door, we got a description of Mr. Wood. She also showed us a photograph of him. She handed it to me, and I immediately turned it over to the doctor, who, before he had it rightly in his hand, pronounced him not the person. There were 3 persons on the card, 2 men and a child. The child was in Mr. Wood's arms. Owing to the position in which he sat, his face was very much shaded, which made it rather difficult of observation. This, together with the fact that Dr. Handy so readily pronounced him not the man, is to my mind very significant. His social relations with Miss Lizzie are very close. She was to spend her vacation at Dr. Handy's cottage at Marion with his daughter. He left Boston for home at 8:30. I went again to police headquarters, and with a detective went to Diebold Safe Company No. 72, Sudbury Street. From there, a mechanic accompanied me home. At 3:15, in company with H.A. Jennings, went to open the safe. I remained there until relieved by the district attorney at about 5 p.m. Dougherty. Orrin Round's car conductor saw a man talking to A.J. Borden 1 week before the murder. They stood at Wooden Hall's corner. Mr. Borden appeared not to desire to talk to him and walked away, but then the man followed him a few steps and then turned north and left him. It seems from the statements of the officers themselves that they've kind of had Lizzie in their sights from the beginning. They're like, she's not responding the way we expect her to respond. People are covering up for her. How could he possibly know it wasn't this guy? Because in the photograph, his face was partially shaded in shadow. So how could he just look at it and be like, yeah, no, it's not him? The clue of Frank Wade on number 58 Snell Street was partially investigated. Well, partially investigated is, I guess, better than not investigated. Summoned Eli Bentz, Frank Kilroy, and Fred Hart to appear at court at 2:30. Went for Fred Hart at 3:45. Was sent to see what progress was being made on the safe. Friday 12, 1892, Harrington. At the Borden house all forenoon assisting on the safe. Afternoon, Dougherty, Medley, and Harrington continued on the Frank Wade clue. Got a boat and rakes, and went all over the pond where he saw the suspicious person. We pulled up much stuff and things, but failed to find the hatchet which he thought might be thrown there. We brought back to the station a paper bag which contained an old banana peel, which was tied up with a very long string. This was very suspicious indeed. We had Mr. Matherson, the superintendent of the Chase Mill, to see we did our work well. He expressed himself as being satisfied we could do no more in that line. They dredged a pond, and they brought back as potential evidence an old banana peel in a paper bag that was tied up with a string. Saturday, 13th, 1892. Went to Forest Hills to see Abner Cogshall. It was reported that he heard cries from the Borden house on the fatal morning. Mr. Cogshall denied this, saying he was at work at Forest Hill, where he had been since early last June. Mr. Frank Thurston, assistant superintendent of streets, confirms this statement. From there we went to Stonebridge to see Gideon Manchester, draw tender, who it was reported told his brother George carried a suspicious person from Newtown to Newport. Mr. Gideon Manchester has had no brother for 3 years. He related the following story. Friday afternoon, S.R. Paquin of Bliss Four Corners told me Manchester carried a man from Newtown to Newport. We went to Newtown, found the Manchester there, of whom there were 2, George and Oscar. They knew nothing of any such person. There is a John Manchester at Bristol Ferry, who carried papers from there to Newport. His son George carried the papers all week and had no passengers. We then drove to Bliss Four Corners, found Paquin. He said it was John Henry Manchester of State Hill, Portsmouth, Rhode Island. His statement: on Friday, August 5th, at 5:30 in the morning, gave a young man a ride to Newport. He was about 20 years of age, belonged to Nova Scotia, worked at Digton, picking strawberries and also in the canning factory. Thought Newport a good place to get employment during the summer. Walked from Dighton to Fall River. Heard of the murder, to which he instantly referred while writing. He said nothing more than a murder had been committed. He was well dressed and smart looking. Fall River, Sunday, August 28, 1892. Monday, August 15, 1892, called at George Bentley's, number 185, North Main Street. Bentley's statement. On Thursday, August 4th, 1892, an Italian, about 24 years, light complexion, not certain of mustache. If he had one, it was small, about 5'7" or 8", 160 or 170 pounds. Called, left a trunken box. Trunk old, sides and ends painted red, top covered with oilcloth and bound with iron hooping. It was tied with a rope which had red sealing wax on each knot. It contained a lot of old clothes, a new gray vest, a lantern, 2 or 3 packets of letters written in Italian, and bearing different foreign postmarks, an old carpet bag, the inside of which was stained with what looked like blood or iron rust. The trunk was marked Elmer's Baggage Express, 42nd Street and 4th Avenue. The box had a tag as follows: 162 American Express Company from Canton Landing, New York, for Peter Carity of 118 Street. What followed was blotched out by ink. New York, another tag from the same company. Peter Carity of New York, another paper, record August 1st, 1892, from Canton. Charges 33 Peter Carity 46. Why not delivered? Yeah, I have no idea what most of this means. Like WC number 8443. These are all some sort of postal markings. Up here it says NY. We can infer that's New York. FRL. This probably would have gone by freight, so maybe freight rail line. So New York Freight Rail Line 28 North Rail, 5 check 2975. That is purely my guess on that. 100% speculation. Yeah, I highly doubt that it was a cloth with blood on it. It probably was most likely iron rust, as they said. Inquired at the depot, but learned nothing of the arrival of these things. Express offices knew nothing of them. Sought for a man of this description in Tiverton, Portsmouth, and Bristol Ferry, Rhode Island. Instructed Bentley not to deliver these articles without notifying the marshal. I am a little mystified as why they think that the killer would be receiving a package, because everything else is expressing that they think the killer is trying to hightail it out of town if they're not busy pointing at Lizzie. So they seem a little everywhere, which I guess for an investigation is good that they're looking at all avenues. They're assuming that it's a family member because they have the most to gain from a death. Other people are like, well, maybe it was a business dispute, so therefore the person left. But why they think the killer stayed and then got a shipment? So the killer is receiving a trunk, and that makes sense how. I guess it was a small enough town that they thought that was suspicious, even though we've clearly established that there's still some foreigners in town. Thursday, 16th, called on Westcook at the Durfee Ice Houses, who directed us to Hiram Brightman of Wilson Road at the head of New Boston Road. There was a man loafing around there who had his face and hands blackened with burned cork or soot, but he had not been seen since July 31st, or the Sunday before the murder. Wednesday, 17th, called on Maurice Libby, from whom we got an old brown and white plaid apron stained with blood. He found it in the yard adjoining his shop on Turner Street. This we left in the office. I really don't know a lot about the Lizzie Borden case, but I have heard people say that she attempted to burn a dress. If memory serves correctly, she said it was stained with paint. So maybe this is that. This is when they got that evidence. Harrington visited Mrs. Jane Grey, Mrs. Borden's stepmother. Her statement: things were not as pleasant at the Borden house as they might be. That is the reason I did not call on Mrs. Borden as often as I would have liked to. I told Mrs. Borden I would not change places with her for all her money. What I know about them is all hearsay. Mrs. Borden was a very close-mouthed woman. She would bear a great deal and say nothing. She told me she and the girls were allowed an equal monthly allowance, but they had more of it than her. For I had to furnish the table coverings, toweling, and other small things of the house out of mine. The complaint from the daughters that we've heard previously is the stepmother was getting all the money. The stepmother is saying, no, we all got the same amount of money, but I should be getting more because I'm the one who has to buy things for the house out of my allowance. Mrs. Phoebe Warner on 2nd Street, with whom Mrs. Currier, Mr. Borden's sister, lived and said, knew nothing substantial. During her sickness, which was quite long, the Bank Street Church took care of her. Mr. Borden and the girls called once in a while. Mr. Borden gave her $10 each Christmas. She heard things were not pleasant there, but knew nothing about them. Friday 19 and Saturday 20 on street duty. Okay. You felt like putting that in your police log? Just, hey, I was on street duty for 2 days. Thanks, Mr. Officer. Sunday 21. Summoning witnesses, Bestcombe A case and wife of 199 2nd Street. Their statement: understood from general talk, the girls and Mrs. Borden did not get along very pleasantly. Never heard Mrs. Borden say anything about the family relations. Her allowance was about $200 a year, but much of it was spent on articles for the house. The lace curtains in the parlor she purchased. The girls got the same amount as she, but it was for their own use. A short time ago, Mrs. Borden, for the first time, told me of the robbery, which took place about a year ago. She simply mentioned it and said she would tell me about it sometime. Mrs. Case directed me to Mrs. Daniel O'Leary on 5th Street who at times worked for the Bordens. She could give me no information. Monday, 22nd, hearing continued. Tuesday, 23rd, interviewed Joseph Derosier and Michael Sullivan. Wednesday, 24th, summoned witnesses. Thursday, 25th, Friday, 26th, and Saturday, 27th, court. I think I'm more surprised that they had court on a Saturday. The hearing he's referring to, I believe, is the one to see if there's enough evidence to try Lizzie Borden. From my understanding, when I was trying to find primary source documents, so it's now not considered as a primary source. And I only wanted the primary source documents. My genealogist, I have covered primary source versus secondary source before on my website. So the primary source document is something that you were there when it happened and you recorded it as or very close to as it happened. And secondary sources are things that you know of secondhand. So that's why, even though this is very dry testimony, it's a primary source document because as things are going, the police officer is writing things down. And he's saying then, hey, on Monday the 22nd, there was a hearing. And then he's like, hey, I interviewed these people on the 23rd. I summoned witnesses on the 24th. Fall River, Saturday, August 27th, 1892. Statement of Lucy G. Collett, aged 18 years. John Norman, clerk for Dr. Conan, telephoned to our house, number 22 Borden Street, requesting me to attend Dr. Conan's house while he drove the doctor and his wife to the depot. This message was received by Father. When he repeated it to me, I looked at the clock. It was 10:45. As I knew there was a train for Providence, where they were going, or rather Pawtucket, through Providence, I hurried to get ready. While in the sitting room, I ran upstairs arranging my hat. I saw the doctor, his wife, and Mr. Norman drive by. I then went to Dr. Conan's, arriving there at 10:50. The door was locked, so I went into the yard to see if the hammock was there. It was not, so I walked around the yard a while, then sat down on the steps. While there, 2 men called, but first, about 10 minutes after I had arrived, which would be about 11. He waited about 10 minutes when he said he had to go. He gave me a bottle and asked me to give it to the clerk and tell him to refill it, and he would call for it this afternoon. When the second man was informed the doctor was not at home, he went away. Both men came up 3rd Street from Borden Street and returned the same way. About 11:45, Mr. Norman returned. We both entered the house, talked a short while, and after having a drink of lemonade, I returned home, arriving just as the clock struck 12. It was by this I fixed the time of Mr. Norman's return. While there at Dr. Conan's, no one came through the door, nor could such be done without my knowing it. I heard no noise or cry. I first heard of the murder when I arrived home. This interview took place at Dr. Collett's house, number 22 Borden Street, Saturday, August 27th, from 3:55 to 4:40. This is my second interview with Miss Collett. Fall River, September 25th, 1892. Mrs. Arubia P. Kirkby, number 29 3rd Street, the next house north of Dr. Conan, says, I was in the kitchen and sink room all during the forenoon of the 4th of August, and could and would have heard and seen anybody who might have gone up or down Dr. Conan's driveway. Dr. Bowen stopped me on the street and was very anxious to know what Mr. Knowlton meant when he referred to having found another agent of death. He was very nervous when talking of this. I told him I did not recollect any such statement in his plea. Now there's a rumor going around that there was another agent of death. So there's another manner of death other than axe to the face. Maybe this was involving how they were looking into poison. Apparently the whole family had been sick the day before, and then the very next day, hatchet to the face. So maybe the rumor that they had been investigating the different drugstores about who was looking to buy poison had gotten around by this point. Lewis L. Hall, number 81 2nd Street, was standing on 2nd Street in front of my office in view of the Borden house for some time before 11 o'clock until Mrs. Churchill ran down and told of the murder. I generally observe whoever's on the street, and I'm most positive I would notice any suspicious character. Kind of sounds like Neighborhood Watch or your neighborhood busybody. Alexander H. Coggeshall, number 143 2nd Street. Was on 2nd Street opposite the Borden house at 11:45, saw no suspicious persons around. Robert Nicholson, number 147 2nd Street. Drove up the street between 11:10 and 11:15. Saw nothing strange. Met Charles Sawyer, A.H. Coggeshall, and several others. Fixed the time by consulting my watch when I arrived in my office. James E. Cannell, number 17, Freedom Street. Drove up 2nd Street that day, and the only strange thing I observed was Dr. Handy's actions. His carriage was up on the west side of the street, about opposite Dr. Kelly's yard. He sat in the buggy and was quickly turning his head from right to left, from left to right. He seemed very nervous, and his strange actions caused me to look around to see what the occasion was, but I observed nothing. Before I reached where he was standing, he started and drove slowly down the street by me. Dr. Handy. Entered 2nd Street from Morgan Street, continued down and turned into Borden Street. Did not stop until I arrived home. Number 37 Rock Street. Now, Mr. Harrington, I never told you I thought the man I saw committed the crime, did I? I never said the man I saw committed the crime, and don't think he did. What was Dr. Handy's original statement? Anyone remember? Whatever his original statement was, now he's saying that, hey, look, I just said I saw a guy. I never said the guy I saw did the murders. Just that I saw a guy. Henry A. Clark, number 39 South Main Street. No, Mr. Borden, never mentioned a will in my shop. He often spoke of his property and rents, but not a will. Charles H. Cook, number 36 Borden Street. Was with John Donnelly in the barn, saw nothing that looked like the imprint of a man. Donnelly had been drinking. Okay. Doesn't mean much that he's been drinking. I mean, like, how drunk was he? Was he even drunk? First, we have children making up stories. We have two men who are claiming they saw things and then claiming they didn't. It's gotta suck to be a police officer when this goes down. So, any law enforcement in the audience, I'm sorry, people suck. Frederick A. Pinkerton, number 8 Forest Street. Was on 2nd Street in view of the Borden house until 10:40 until I saw Officer Allen come up the street. Mark Chase. Was around the express company's stable opposite the Borden house all forenoon. Was back and forth from the stable to V. Wade's store several times between 10:30 and 11:15. Saw nothing suspicious. Leander A. Winslow, number 95 2nd Street. Had been standing at the store door for some time when the lady named Mary Watt told me of the murder. Thomas J. L. Brown and Fred Lavelle, number 43 3rd Street. Were in the yard at the Fall River Ice Company. Saw no persons go by who looked suspicious. I do not particularly like the practice of interviewing people together. There's a reason we tend to do this separately. Carrie E. Rogers, number 25 Cherry Street. Was on 2nd Street at 11 o'clock, saw nothing strange. John Egan, number 20 Pearl Street. Drove up and down 2nd Street several times between 10:30 and 11:15. Sarah Gray, number 103 2nd Street. Was in the store. Not busy. Saw nothing strange. I think I would notice a person if there was anything remarkable about him. Macy C. McCumber, Westport. Stood in front of Wade's store for 10 to 20 minutes talking to several persons. I then drove the street to Lewis L. Hall's and was standing there when Mrs. Churchill ran down. Mrs. Churchill was the same one who went over and was like, "Oh, Lizzie, oh, Lizzie." Apparently her way home involved telling everybody about the murder. Mrs. Mary Wyatt, number 91 2nd Street. This woman lives over Dr. Bowen. It is she who first told Mr. M. Chase L. Winslow and several others who were standing in front of Wade's about the crime. She dodged us for a week or more, and when finally seen, positively refused to be interviewed. Lots of people, past or present, do not want to talk to the police. They don't want to get involved. Not their circus, not their monkeys, not their murders. Elizabeth M. Johnson, number 24 Ridge Street. I have said all I think I should about that letter. Harry Pierce, number 25 3rd Street. Was on 2nd Street in front of L.L. Hall's for some time before Mrs. Churchill came. William L. Hacking, number 10 Hartwell Street. Passed the Borden house at about 10:30. Went to A. Rich's and remained there until 10:55. George Petty, number 98, 2nd Street. Went to the house with Dr. Bowen on his second visit. Mr. Borden had the appearance of having been killed but a short while, for the blood was fresh and flowing. Went upstairs, got down on my knees to examine Mrs. Borden's head. At once I saw she had been dead some time, and told the doctor she must have been dead an hour. I further said this is where the trouble began. This is the starting point. The blood had ceased to flow. It was dark and covered with a kind of skin. Mrs. Jane Grey, number 215, 2nd Street. Dr. Bowen's character is at least suspicious. 4 years ago, while the Borden family was summering over the river in the farm, Lizzie remained at home. One Sunday evening during this time, she and Dr. Bowen came to church together and sat in the Borden seat. I myself saw them this evening. At the time and since, there was much comment on this act. Some remarked how courageous she was to remain in the house alone, but others replied in a knowing way perhaps she was very acceptable company. About the robbery, I think Mrs. Fish or her daughter-in-law at Hartford knows more or less about it if they wish to tell. Fall River, Saturday, October 1st, 1892. Bridget Sullivan. Yes, I left New Bedford for good. I did not like the way the papers spoke of me. Said I was in New Bedford jail. And I got a postal card from the court requesting me to call for my witness fees. And that was addressed to New Bedford jail. I did not like this, so I thought I should show them I would not stay any longer. I think I'll try to get a place here through Mrs. McKinney's agency. If not, I may go to Newport, Rhode Island and work in the hotel where I was employed before. I have relatives in South Bethlehem, and as I have worked there before, I may go again. In a joking manner, she said she may go back to Ireland. She promised wherever she would go, she would let me know through Mrs. Harrington of Division Street. She saw nobody about this case since the trial, but several called at New Bedford, and she would not see them. Neither would she in the future, for she was tired of the whole thing. I think it'll be hard for me to get a place, but no one wants to hire a person for 1 month. I think the district attorney should give me something for my time. The papers and postal card made me feel badly, but aside from them, I got tired over there. I had nothing to do but look at the walls of the prison, and I found 7 gray hairs in my head. I would rather have a place where I would have something to do. No, I never at any time saw Lizzie put anything in. Neither did I ever throw any milk away. Whatever milk was left, and that wasn't much, I drank it, for I don't like tea. That story is not true. Did you see anybody wash their hands that day? Yes, sir. Dr. Colin and Dr. Dolan. I do not see how Dr. Dolan forgot that. I remembered it well, for I gave him a towel. This was in the kitchen. Dr. Colin was first. I know nothing about upstairs. No, I did not empty the basin, and I do not know who did. I think the wood was chopped over the river. At one time, one of the farm hands chopped a few planks for kindling. I never had occasion to use a hatchet but once, and that was to take the heels off my shoes. When I returned from Miss Russell's, I asked Lizzie if I could go to Mrs. Whitehead's to see if Mrs. Borden was there. It was then Lizzie said, no, I think I heard her come in. So this is obviously after the hearing. She has been arrested for the murder and then apparently released. And she's like, yeah, no, you people suck. I'm out of here. And you people continue to suck because you keep sending my mail to the jail. Dr. Albert Z. Dedrick. I was going on a call to Whipple Street when I saw Dr. Dolan drive along 2nd Street like mad and stop at Mr. Borden's. When I returned, there was a large crowd there, and I went in. Mr. Borden's left hand, which was resting on his hip, was smeared with blood. I called Dr. Bowen's attention to it. I went upstairs, and as I entered, I noticed the basin, which was on the washstand, contained water stained with blood. Called Dr. Bowen's attention to this, and he said perhaps some of the doctors washed their hands there. Afterwards, I saw Dr. Dolan wash his hands there. I remember this distinctly, for I had put my hands in Mrs. Borden's wounds, And when I had washed my hands, I took the towel from Dr. Dolan, who had just finished drying his. I think Mrs. Borden was dead first, for when I took hold of her arm, it was cold, clammy, and very stiff. When I took hold of Mr. Borden to look at all the blood on his hand, it bent very easily. I do not want to get into the case, but I tell you just as I saw and found things. Bridget also mentioned milk, and we read in episode 1 that the officer told them to throw out the milk. So why they're asking her about the milk is beyond me, because it's in officer's statements. That, hey, I was told to throw out the milk. Oh no, you're going to do it? Awesome, fine. I'm going to go do the other thing you told me to do. But I do think that Mrs. Borden being killed first does make more sense than the other way around of her not running up the stairs and dying of fright. It makes sense for the entire thing to start upstairs and then work its way downstairs. Fall River, September 29th, 1892. Wednesday, September 29th at 5:30. The marshal ordered me to Providence, Rhode Island. I arrived at Providence about 7 p.m. and went directly to the house of E.P. McHenry, College Street. At 7:15, Henry G. Trickey of the Boston Daily Globe called at Mr. McHenry's. He was ushered into the parlor, where the following conversation between Messrs. Trickey and McHenry was overheard by me. Substantially, it was as follows. This is going to get annoying very quickly. A reporter from the Boston Daily Globe met up with another guy, and the officer is recording the conversation. I'm assuming verbatim. For those of you listening to this and not watching, apparently they're taking turns talking. This is very polite conversation. So if you get lost or I mess up with my bad vocals here, because they're all bad vocals, that's what's going on. Beggary. I waited up there until I got tired. Well, mister, I fixed the deal with Adams. There's $1,000 to be had for the prosecution's case. Something was said about $200 from the paper business. Mel Adams has the $1,000 ready to pay over the minute. The evidence of the prosecution was obtained by him. I will come down tomorrow night and get the whole business, take it to Adams, get the money and turn it over to you. The first proposition made to me, as you know, was $500. That came from Adams. But the $1,000 was later agreed to by Jennings. Adam having sent for him and talked the matter over, he, Jennings, then went and saw Lizzie, and she assented to it. And Jennings wrote Adams it was all right. Jennings then called on Adams and told him he had seen Lizzie and agreed to the proposition. So the money will be paid. There'll be $500 for you and $500 for me. You know, Tricky, they're not looking for the murderer. Of course not. All they want is the evidence of the government. Now let me tell you something. I asked Mel Adams if he thought Lizzie was not guilty. He said I'm counsel for her, cannot speak. But there is something I'll show you. He handed me a letter, which was from his wife, and it read something like this. I am ashamed to think that my husband has interested himself in the defense of this woman, when he knows she's guilty. Had no business to have anything to do with her case. Now, Tricky, what do you think of Jennings? Did you see him to talk about this matter? No, I'm doing business with Adams. Adams said Jennings was a provincial fellow and doesn't know anything. When he was spoken to about this deal, at first he would not do it. I could do nothing with him. He was too much of a Puritan. I suppose you know Adams got Hanscom into this case. They're great friends. It was Adams who defended Hanscom when in trouble with the Boston police. No, Adams stands well with the Pinkertons. He is a pretty shrewd fellow and stands well in with the crooks. When he was assistant district attorney, he would go to them and assure them he had nothing against them, and then say, did you do this? I won't be hard on you. You know what this meant? So as to get their business when he got out of office. As I said before, he defended Hanscom at his hearing before the police commission. They're both good friends and always work together. Tricky, you must have a step on Seaver getting information in this case while you were in Fall River. No, Mr. Seaver only gave me the groundwork every day to go do. For instance, he would say, today the axe is the principal subject. The next day the tip would be the bottle of acid, and so on. It was true he gave me such tips every day I saw him, but he did not give me everything. That is, he would not give me the whole subject. He would merely hint at the subject, and then I would go do the work. I get most of my information indirectly from Harrington and Dougherty. The prussic acid story I got indirectly from them through a friend of theirs, whom I gave $25. The party to whom I gave up the $25 is a policeman on the inside. What about Medley? Oh, he's cheap. I got him any time for a couple of beers. He's the cheapest chump of them all. What about the mayor? He was one of my best friends. I got a great deal from him. He's a dandy for staying up nights. I tell you, he gave me lots of good news. Now about the deal with Adams. I cannot see him tonight, as he lives out of town. I think in Worcester. But I'll see him about 8:30 tomorrow morning. After 9 o'clock, nobody can find him. Sometimes he goes to Cambridge. How about advancing some money now as a retainer? Well, of course I cannot do so now, for I haven't got the stuff. But Adams is thoroughly honest. I know this, for I've worked with him before. And as soon as you have the evidence ready, there'll be no delay about the money. Now, old man, how will this money be paid, in cash or check? You know a check can be very easily stopped. He does not do business that way. I would trust Adams with anything. You may come to Boston with me or not. Perhaps it would be better not to be seen in Boston together. The Pinkertons might catch on. What time will it be convenient for you to see me? Tomorrow. Make it late in the afternoon. I'm not feeling well. I will leave Boston about 3 p.m. and arrive here about 6 p.m. Have your notes ready and arrange them like this. John Jones, number, street, will testify as follows. Then, what he knows in full. How many witnesses did you say there were? 17. Do you think the evidence that has not been submitted of importance? Very. Does Bridget know much more than she has told? Oh, yes, much. There are 3 or 4 very important witnesses, and they should be kept out of the state. They're under my control. They have made affidavits, and I as notary swore them. Can these people be kept out of the state? Yes, Bridget ought to be sent out of the country. Her out of the country, we could get a house. And when will the grand jury meet? I don't know, but I think sometime in October. We'll keep this back for some time. Until the grand jury meets? We will publish it a few days before. That will give Adams a chance to work things 3 or 4 days before we publish this. I'll go to Fall River. I'll spend much time there among these people and put some time in around Jennings' office. And no one will be able to tell where the story came from. Neither you nor I can afford to lose our reputation for $500. And if you give me straight goods, we can get. Do you think that from the government has got Lizzie to be convicted? Yes. Once while Adams and Lizzie were talking, I was under the bed and I heard every word. This was unintentional, for I think it is not honorable to listen to what a lawyer and client might say. But this time it could not be helped, as there was no time to arrange matters differently before Adams came in. Why, there was someone in the room nearly all the time, and all the conversation between Lizzie and her friends was overheard. What a story that will make! We'll have a large picture of you and your wife, and the room with a bed and a person under it. I made Billings come to his knees. I had not spoke to him for 4 years, and he came to me and apologized, and acknowledged I had outdone him. I'll show those fellows how to do things. Adams, when talking about this case, said, I think I will soon give up this criminal business and go entirely into the civil. I'm getting tired of trying to keep criminals out of jail and the rope away from their necks. Why don't Hanscom take the hatchet away with him? He was around there long enough. I would if I had to split the handle and put the blade in my pocket. Tricky laughed at this and said, I don't know. But Bob Pinkerton called him off the case. You a typewriter? What make is it? Never mind. I guess I can run it. I have a little typewriter in Boston and I'll bring her down. You have your notes ready and I will dictate them to her so they will be in proper form. Will this evidence fill up much space? Will it occupy 2 columns? Yes, there are 2 witnesses that will fill up a column apiece. Then I can get a whole piece out of it. No need to bring a typewriter down here. My wife runs the machine. Is the lawyer who was mentioned in the papers the right man? No. You give your word the evidence is valuable, and it's only a matter of turning the evidence over to Adams. And I know the money will be all right. Now, Tricky, I think it's not asking too much of you to give me some money. That is just what I want myself, as my creditors are pushing me for a couple $100. The sooner this thing is settled, the better it will be. Then Jennings first approached Adams about coming into this case. He asked Adams if $250 would be sufficient as retainer. Adams said, no, I want $500. In this case, and Jennings, after seeing Lizzie, made it right with Adams. I know that. That is what he got. Tricky to a question. The reason Adams did not consummate this deal before was because he was not sure of remaining in the case. But now he is. He said they were seriously considering the idea of obtaining assistance. I know they have had agents in New York and heard they consulted Mark Cochran, but they could not get him, for he was playing in big houses. They will catch on to a big one somewhere. I was surprised this afternoon to learn how much your wife knows about what we've been talking. Yes, she knows all. She's my confidant. While she was under Lizzie's bed, she took shorthand notes, and her evidence will be very interesting. You need not fear her. I would trust her with my life. The money is ready, Mick, and we have evidence. The above conversation was overheard by John F. Golden and myself. The room in which Tricky and McHenry met is on the second floor and measures 15 feet 8 inches by 15 feet 2 inches. Height of room 8 feet 7 inches. The room contained a piano, lounge, 2 oak tables, 1 rocking chair, 2 common chairs, 2 small chairs for children, 1 writing desk, and small fancy table. There are 3 doors in the room, one leading to the main hall, one to a small hall, and the other to the cupboard in which Golden and I were secreted. The small hall door and the door leading to the cupboard were covered with portieres. The door to this room was unhinged, and in front of it, facing the parlor, stood a large picture on an easel. This picture measured 4.3 by 3.5. The room in which we were was 4.7 by 4.7. Height the same as parlor. There was a small trunk in this room. Okay, I'm assuming that the reason the police were there in the first place was because they had some sort of tip that there were shenanigans. So all the previous statements that we read from Harrington and Dougherty, this reporter had apparently embedded himself around the subject matter, which arguably is a reporter's job. So he was getting hints not necessarily from Harrington and Dougherty, but he found the people that were working with them and associated with them and was either out and out bribing them, or as they said about Medley, bought him a couple beers and he spilled everything about the case. The greatest part of this is that the 2 gentlemen, McHenry and Tricky, are talking about how McHenry and his wife were hiding under a bed while Lizzie and her lawyer were discussing the case. Meanwhile, the 2 police officers were hiding in a cupboard listening to the conversation. I just love all the hiding going on. Everyone is hiding, listening to everyone else. Okay, this next section is also going to be Tricky and McHenry, but they're also throwing in McHenry's wife, which they just refer to as Mrs. McHenry. Providence, Rhode Island, Monday, October 10th, 1892. Henry G. Tricky of the Boston Globe came in company with E.D. McHenry to the latter's house at 11:30 p.m. In the house at this time was Mrs. McHenry, Jason B. Carroll, John F. Golden, Dennis Desmond Jr., and Philip Harrington. The following took place in the dining room, which McHenry entered first, Tricky soon following. As Tricky entered, both he and McHenry began to talk together. What was said I did not understand distinctly until McHenry said, "No, I will say no more, until you make the letter straight with my wife. Nellie, come in here." As she entered, all began to talk at once. Owing to their excitement, it was impossible to catch what was said. When quiet was restored, Mr. Tricky said, "Nick, you have not dealt squarely with me in this matter. What about the agreement? Have you been honest with me? I did not know it was to be published and did not intend it should be until Tuesday or Wednesday. It was as much a surprise to me as it was to you. Did you not say you would see me 24 hours before you published the matter?" "I know I did." "You agreed to see me at midnight Saturday?" "Yes, but when I received you dispatch at the Gladstone Hotel, I was called to the office, and then for the first time learned it was to be published." "Why did you not telephone me then?" "It was too late then, and I did not wish to disturb you." "Well, you promised to let us know 24 hours before publishing it." "I know that." "Well, you did not keep your agreement."
We rushed the fellows down to Fall River this morning and found all the names and addresses wrong. The whole thing crooked. Do you mean to say you were straight? Were you not to give me $200 more? I gave you $200 in Attleboro. Yes, but part of that was to go to my wife. No. And I was not to get $500? Yes. Wasn't part of the $200 which you gave Mick at Attleboro to go to me for the purpose of getting Bridget away? No, I said nothing of Bridget. Why, you certainly did, for you told me so. You don't know anything about the agreement in Attleboro, only what he told you. What are you talking about? That is just what you said in Attleboro. I never made any contract I did not live up to. No man ever heard me make a statement I did not carry out. Oh, yes, they have. Have you not done what you promised in this transaction? Did you not promise that I would have $500? Yes, but the stuff was not straight. Well, that is your own fault. You promised not to publish it until you gave me 24 hours notice. Yes, that is so, but I could not avoid it, and now all the statements are crooked. I thought the Globe's interest in these statements was of a secondary consideration. Here the three began to talk all at once, and use the name of Adams, but there was so much clatter I could not get the sentences. Now, Mick, I want these correct names and addresses. Charles H. Taylor Jr. sent 5 men down there to verify the story, and if I don't get the right names tonight, a new story will be published in the paper, and we will roast you. Then if that's the case, I refuse to give you a thing, and you may go ahead and roast. Well, good night, Mick. Now, do you wish to reconsider before I go and give me the right names? I'll give you nothing. Weren't you to get the stuff, the evidence for Adams? You don't understand the Attleboro agreement. During the conversation, all three were very much excited. I saw Mr. Tricky as he entered and passed from the dining room. All right, everyone, that looks like a good stopping point for episode 2, part 2 of the witness statements. We have had some fun with people hiding in closets and other people hiding under beds. We will resume later on with episode 3. We will still be in witness statements for episode 3. So until then, happy hunting.